Government policy promotes retrofitting. They say we should be doing tens of thousands of properties every week as the only way we're going to meet the carbon reduction targets set internationally by Europe. In practice, it's simply not happening. The people who will do refurbishment are housing associations, and they do it when they take over properties and convert them to use. But in practice, they're not taking over many old properties these days. So, what about us, the owner-occupiers? If you talk to policy geeks, they'll suggest that you're going to do a whole house in one go. But in fact, the work is so completely disruptive. What we should be more sensibly looking at is when you're doing major work, to do it a bit at a time. In my case, I had two lodgers who'd regularly bring all their friends over, and there'd be like an hour-long queue for the bathroom and the toilet. So I decided the time had come to put a few more bathrooms and toilets in, and while I was doing that, I started to work on retrofitting. This was about 6-7 years ago. As part of those works, we did improve the insulation to the house, putting insulation between the rafters and putting some insulation against the walls, but it really wasn't to the standard to which I would work nowadays. Most people are familiar with loft insulation. This is an old piece of glass fibre insulation. Absolutely fine where it's not going to be compressed and where it's not against a wall and may collapse over time. The main weakness of the traditional glass fibre was it was horrible to install because you were itching for days afterwards. Nowadays, for DIY purposes, much more common is the plastic-based fibre, which has the same effect. In this house, the rigid board will be used to go under the joists and will then put the fibre on top of the joists. It also goes in places where we haven't got a plaster surface, so we've been using this behind the skirting boards. Internally, against the stripped walls, we've been using this dry lining plaster with a phenolic foam backing. To comply with current building regulations, it needs to be a lot thicker than this. So with a 9-inch brick wall, solid brick wall, you need a total thickness of 70 millimetres, and therefore you'd have about 1 centimetre of plasterboard, you'd have your thin layer of foil, and then on the other side of that you'd have 60 millimetres of phenolic foam. With any building work, you predict everything you can, but some things change when you get to do the work. So, these walls look perfectly dry at the moment, otherwise I should be mounting the plasterboard on battens, but we've said no, it's okay to just use drywall adhesive. Of course, when we came to this room and hacked the plaster off, we found that around the lower levels of the walls there was what looked like tanking, as if there had been a damp proofing problem in the past. And we took the view that although we're going to lose some of the insulation, we would actually not disturb all the bricks by taking off the tanking. It had been put there for a purpose. So what we've used is a thinner layer of insulation straight on to the render, and then we'll use the thicker insulation over the rest of the walls. What I've discovered as I've done one room after another is you can actually get away with putting quite thick boarding onto the wall, as long as you've got a good decorator to cut back in and conceal the fact that actually the wall's coming out further than the cornice. The problem in theory with that is that you then end up with the potential of cold bridging around the cornice, i.e. that is the coldest part of the room and that's where condensation forms. In reality, I believe in this house there's other places which will give a cold bridging problem, and that's where the dew will form. So again, understand the science but use common sense in applying it. There are a number of different backings for plasterboard, and the more you pay, the better the insulation standard. The first job to do is to cut the plasterboard to size as accurately as possible. Thinner thicknesses of insulation you can cut with a knife, a Stanley knife or a small saw, but in reality you might as well use a decent jigsaw to cut it to size and to make it as precise a fit as possible, because you really don't want any bits of cold bridging around the edges where you're not insulating right up to the outside wall. So after that, it's a question of making up drywall adhesive, laying it on the board. People talk about dot and dab, but if you ask for technical advice, they say if you can put a little ribbon of adhesive around the outside, that traps some air inside it, so you get an extra layer of insulation. We go on the side, yeah? So here we are in the ground floor front room with the fanciest cornicing of the lot, and in fact the board that we have here is 60mm board, which is totally compliant with pre-October building regulation standards. This wall is going to be really well insulated, and as you can see there's almost 60mm of the highest quality foam product available backing onto the plaster, which we've just fitted in place. Once this is plastered in, you won't be able to see the difference from the wall before it was treated, except perhaps it'll be a bit flatter and hopefully a bit better finished. I'm now in the first floor front bedroom, where I first got involved in using my ideas for how you insulate an external wall. Now, we have cornicing here. It's not as fancy as the cornicing downstairs, but I still thought it was worth keeping. So the challenge is, how do you put insulated backed board on a wall without messing up the cornicing? So I looked for the most expensive available at the time, because if you're going to spend all the money on fitting it, you might as well get the best. And I got phenolic foam back board, and I was really scared about losing the width from the wall, so I only used 30mm board. Now, I did these two external walls some time ago, and what I've realised is that as long as you decorate sensibly, there really is no loss of cornicing whatsoever, because the eye from the ground simply doesn't see the fact that the wall comes out further than it would have done originally. I've then come back and since done a little bit more work in here. So I took out the old double glazed windows, which were badly fitting and leaking anyway, and have reinstalled sash windows, but sash windows that are compliant with modern building regulation standards. So there's minimal amount of draft through them. Still, the sash box is not going to be insulated. You've got to have space for the weights to move up and down, and so parts of it aren't brilliantly insulated.
At the moment we're in the basement. The house had actually sunk 2 inches, especially around the staircase, which takes a lot of weight. So we've literally jacked the house up 2 inches, braced it with these timbers and cemented at the bottom, including this, which was the main beam that holds the staircase up, and it's sitting on a padstone to take the weight of the staircase. So then our foam walls go on, which are held by ply. And then the rock wool insulation goes on top of that, so literally there's no loss of heat. And then along the joist we tack these tracks, into which will go the 80mm pipe, which will run the hot water that will give us the heat. From there we're going to unroll a big sheet of aluminium on top of all of it, which will conduct the heat further into the middle area.
When you build a new house, to make it energy efficient, you have to take account of which direction it faces, and you make maximum use of the sun. Of course, when you're refurbishing an old house, you don't have that freedom. You have to work with what you're given. In my case, the house faces east-west, but the back addition has a roof which faces south. I estimate that by putting photovoltaics on the back addition roof, I can probably pay back the cost of installing it in between 7 and 10 years. Now elsewhere, what we can do with the roof space is obviously limited by the fact we're in a conservation area. The other area of renewables that does pay back quite effectively is the use of solar water heating. So there is a dormer window on the attic bedroom, and by putting solar heating panels on the top of that dormer window, we can again create a renewable heating source that doesn't impact on the conservation area and the square.